Today I will tell a story that started with love but ended in betrayal. It will show how love can break a heart into pieces. Listen carefully. It can happen to anyone. Let's go. I never thought my life in Boston could change so drastically. My name is Jake, and I worked as a bus driver for the city transportation department. My wife Emma was a cashier at a supermarket near our home. We met at a bus stop 5 years ago and have been inseparable ever since. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I had just started working on a new route and was a little nervous. Emma was waiting for the bus, holding a tattered novel in her hands. When she stepped up into the cabin, our eyes met and I felt something tingle in my chest. She smiled, and I forgot how to breathe. From that day on, I started waiting for her at the bus stop every morning, and soon we started talking. Our life was simple but happy. We rented a small one-bedroom apartment in not the most upscale neighborhood in Boston, but we had enough. Every penny counted. We saved up for a down payment on our own place and dreamed of the future. On weekends, we liked to walk in the park, have picnics, and make plans for the future. Emma dreamed of opening a small bookstore, and I wanted to become a driving instructor. When Emma became pregnant, we were thrilled, although a little apprehensive. The baby wasn't planned, and we knew it would be tight financially. But the thought of having a baby outweighed any fears. We began to prepare for the arrival of a new member of the family. We bought used baby clothes on sale, read books on parenting, organized a children's corner in our small apartment. Emma's pregnancy was not easy. She had to leave work earlier than we had planned because of severe toxemia. I saw how hard it was for her and tried to support her as best I could. I cooked her favorite meals, massaged her swollen feet after a long day, read books aloud to her when she couldn't sleep due to nausea. I took extra shifts to make up for the loss of income. I often worked 12, 14 hours a day, but I didn't complain. It was all for the sake of our family, for our future child. We saved money on everything. We gave up cable TV, stopped ordering takeout. I even learned how to cut Emma's hair myself to save money on a hairdresser. Despite all the hardships, it was a happy time. We chose a name for the baby together, arguing about whether it would be a boy or a girl. Emma insisted we were having a son, while I was sure it would be a girl. We decided that if it was a boy, we would name him Ethan, and if it was a girl, Sophia. The birth came out of the blue, 2 months ahead of schedule. I had just finished my night shift when Emma called me from home. Her voice shook with fear and pain. I rushed home in a cab, having spent a week's wages. But at that moment, money was the last thing on my mind. When I saw Emma sitting on the floor in a pool of amniotic fluid, I realized that our lives would never be the same again. The journey to the hospital seemed endless. Emma was moaning in pain, and I felt completely helpless. I tried to reassure her, telling her that everything would be okay, even though I didn't believe it. A team of doctors met us in the emergency room, and Emma was immediately taken to the labor and delivery ward. Everything in the hospital was a blur. The doctors talked about premature labor, risks, complications. I stood next to Emma, holding her hand, feeling her squeeze my fingers during contractions. The hours stretched on endlessly. I prayed to every god I knew, asking for a happy outcome. After hours of agonizing anticipation, our son, whom we named Ethan, was born. He was so small and fragile it was scary to even touch him. He weighed only 2 pounds and fit in the palm of my hand. The doctors immediately took him to the neonatal intensive care unit. We could only see Ethan through the glass, surrounded by tubes and wires. The first few days after Ethan was born passed like a nightmare. We practically lived in the hospital, sleeping on chairs in the hallway. I tried to work, but my thoughts were constantly with my family. My bosses were sympathetic to my situation and allowed me to take shifts whenever possible. Colleagues raised some money to help us, and it moved me to tears. Emma stayed in the cuvette with Ethan, looking at him through the glass for hours. She talked to him, sang lullabies to him, even though she couldn't even touch him. I could see her suffering from not being able to hold her son in her arms, and my heart broke with pain. On the 5th day, we received news that turned our lives upside down. Ethan had been diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. The doctor took a long time to explain the diagnosis, but I only remember bits and pieces of phrases. Aggressive, immediate treatment, chances are slim. Every word was like a hammer to the head. We were in shock. How could this happen to our baby, who had barely made it into the world? Emma sobbed, unable to believe what was happening. I tried to hold on, but everything inside was tearing with pain and fear. At that moment, I realized that our old life was over and a new one began, the life of parents of a seriously ill child. The fight for Ethan's life began. Days merged into an endless series of tests, procedures, consultations with doctors. The medical bills grew at an alarming rate. We sold the car, went into debt, and I worked my ass off, picking up any extra shifts. Every dollar went to Ethan's treatment. Emma became completely immersed in Ethan's care. She spent days and nights at the hospital, refusing to go home even for a few hours. I could see her thinning and pale, but there was nothing I could do about it. All attempts to persuade her to rest or eat were met with a blank wall of despair and guilt. Gradually, I began to notice how Emma was changing. Her eyes, once full of life and laughter, now seemed wan. She smiled less and less, hardly spoke to me at all. All her thoughts and feelings were centered on Ethan. I tried to reach out to her, reminding her of our love, of our plans for the future. But it was as if she couldn't hear me. Our relationship was starting to come apart at the seams. We no longer talked about anything but Ethan's illness and medical bills. There were no more dinners together, no more walks in the park, no more plans for the future. Our whole lives centered within the walls of the hospital. After a month of grueling struggle, we were told that the standard treatment was not working. Ethan needed expensive experimental therapy. We both realized that we could not afford such treatment, but to give up trying to save our son was unthinkable. I started looking for a second job, selling everything I could sell. Our apartment was empty. We parted with the TV, the computer, even the wedding rings, but we still didn't have enough money. I applied to charity foundations, wrote letters to newspapers, tried to organize fundraising through social networks. Emma, on the other hand, seemed to shut herself off from the world. She'd almost stopped eating and sleeping, devoting all her energy to Ethan. I tried to talk to her, to convince her that we had to stick together, that it was the only way we could help our son. But she just brushed it off, saying I didn't understand how she felt. One night, returning to the hospital after another shift, I found Emma crying by Ethan's bedside. She looked up at me, eyes full of pain and despair, and said, "I can't take it anymore, Jake. I can't handle it." I put my arms around her, trying to comfort her, but I could feel her tense up in my embrace. The next morning, Emma was gone. All I found was a short note on my bedside table. "I'm sorry, I can't take it anymore. Take better care of him than I did." The world around me collapsed overnight. I was left alone with a seriously ill child in my arms, not knowing what to do next. The days after Emma's departure became one endless nightmare. Every morning I woke up hoping that it was all just a bad dream, that I would turn around and see her sleeping next to me. But reality kicked in every time. The empty half of the bed, the silence of the apartment punctuated only by the beeping of medical equipment in Ethan's room. The pain of betrayal was eating away at me like acid. I couldn't understand how Emma could do this to us, how she could leave her newborn baby at the most difficult moment of his life. Every time I looked at Ethan, so small and defenseless in his hospital crib, a wave of anger and resentment swept over me. "How could you, Emma?" I whispered into the void, clenching my fists until they hurt. "How could you leave him, abandon us?" On nights when Ethan finally fell asleep, exhausted from yet another procedure or bout of crying, I let my emotions run wild. Silent sobs shook my body as I sat on the bathroom floor with my face in my lap. I cried from pain, from exhaustion, from fear of the future, but most of all from feelings of betrayal and loneliness. During the day, I tried to hold myself together. For Ethan's sake, I put on a mask of calm and confidence. I smiled at him, softly hummed lullabies, gently stroked his tiny fingers. But inside me, a storm of emotions raged. Every time a nurse or doctor asked about Emma, I felt the color of shame flood my face. She couldn't handle it," I mumbled, averting my eyes. I felt like everyone around me was judging me, thinking I was somehow to blame for her leaving. Most of all, I was tormented by the thought that I'd let Ethan down, that I'd left him without a mother. Maybe if I had been stronger, if I had supported Emma better, she wouldn't have left. These thoughts haunted me day and night, keeping me awake. Taking care of Ethan's newborn, and a sick one at that, was taking its toll. I learned how to change diapers, prepare formula, monitor AFARs and readings. Every procedure, every medication was like a battle for my son's life. And in this battle, I was alone. Sleepless nights at Ethan's bedside were followed by days full of worry and concern. I was thin, gaunt, with dark circles under my eyes. But worse than the physical exhaustion was the emotional devastation. I felt drained, as if I had been sucked dry. It was especially hard in times of crisis. One night, Ethan's fever spiked. He was crying nonstop, his little body burning like a fire. I tossed between the crib and the phone, trying to reach the doctor and calm my son at the same time. "Shh, baby, it's going to be okay," I whispered, wiping tears from his tiny cheeks. "Daddy's here, Daddy's near." But inside me, everything was screaming with desperation and fear. More than ever, in that moment I felt Emma's absence. I wanted to scream, to call for her help. But she wasn't there. I was alone, and that realization brought a lump to my throat. When the crisis passed and Ethan finally fell asleep, I sat on the floor next to his crib and burst into tears. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I whispered like a mantra, "I can't do this, Emma. I can't cope without you." But she didn't come. Days added up to weeks, and I didn't hear from Emma. I tried to find her. I called friends, relatives, even went to the police, but she seemed to vanish into thin air. This silence, this absence, was perhaps the most painful. It spoke louder than any words. She really didn't care. The financial problems came with renewed force. The medical bills were piling up like a snowball. I worked my ass off, picking up extra shifts and part-time jobs. Every dollar went to Ethan's treatment. I sold almost all the furniture from the apartment, leaving only the essentials. But I still didn't have enough money. One night, sitting at the kitchen table looking at another hospital bill, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. How could I handle all of this alone? How could I give Ethan everything he needed? In that moment, the thought of giving it all up seemed so tempting, to just walk away like Emma had done. But then I heard Ethan crying softly from the next room, and the thought vanished like it never existed. I couldn't give up. I couldn't betray my son the way his mother had. "Coming, baby," I said, wiping away unsolicited tears. "Daddy's coming." Every day was a struggle with Ethan's illness, with financial problems, with my own fears and doubts. But the hardest of all was the struggle with loneliness, especially in the evenings, when Ethan fell asleep and I was alone with my thoughts. I missed Emma. I missed her smile, her laugh, the warmth of her embrace. Sometimes, in moments of weakness, I imagined her coming back, sitting by Ethan's bedside together, holding hands and praying for his recovery. But then reality would intrude on those fantasies, and the pain would return with renewed vigor. Emma wasn't coming back. She chose to leave, leaving us alone, and that was something we had to live with. Slowly, I began to notice how I was changing. Every day I fought for Ethan's life. Every minute I spent at his bedside made me stronger. I learned how to deal with the vagaries of health insurance, learned all the terms associated with my son's illness, and became an expert in caring for a newborn with cancer. But most importantly, I learned to live with the pain of betrayal. It didn't go away, no. It became a part of me, like a scar that will never completely go away. But I learned not to let that pain rule my life. There were days when the longing for Emma would come back with renewed vigor. In those moments, I would allow myself to wallow, pull out our old photo album and reminisce about happier times. But then I'd close the album and return to reality, to Ethan, who needed me here and now. One day, sitting by Ethan's sleeping bedside, I caught myself thinking that I was no longer looking forward to Emma's return. This realization was bittersweet, but also liberating. I was no longer wasting energy on fruitless hopes. All my love, all my strength now belonged to Ethan, alone. "We'll get through this, baby," I whispered, adjusting the blanket around his skinny shoulders. "We'll handle everything together." Days added up to weeks, weeks to months. Ethan's condition was slowly but surely improving. Every smile he smiled, Every little bit of progress gave me the strength to move forward. I began to notice my view of the world changing. I used to see Emma's departure as nothing but betrayal and pain. Now I began to realize that maybe she just couldn't take it anymore, that the weight of responsibility and fear was too much for her. It didn't justify what she'd done, but it helped me let go of my anger and resentment. I no longer spent my energy hating Emma. Instead, I put all my energy into taking care of Ethan and fighting for our future. I started attending a support group for parents of children with cancer. There I met people who understood my pain, my fears, my hopes. Martha, the mother of a girl with leukemia, once said to me, "You know, Jake, you're a lot stronger than you think. What you're doing for Ethan is quite a feat." Those words touched me to the core. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone in my struggle, that there were people who saw and appreciated my efforts. Gradually, I learned to find joy in the little things. In a ray of sunshine through the blinds of a hospital room, Ethan's first smile when I made funny faces at him, the moment of peace and quiet when we just lay next to each other and I could feel his warm breath on my cheek. But there were hard days too, days when Ethan got worse, when the pain and fear returned with renewed vigor. In those moments, I felt helpless and alone. As the months passed, our lives slowly began to take on a new rhythm. Ethan and I learned to live together, supporting each other. I became more organized, learning to combine work, caring for my son, and household chores. But sometimes, especially at night, when fatigue took its toll, waves of longing and loneliness came over me. I missed simple things, the opportunity to share with someone the joy of Ethan's small victories, the warmth of a loved one's embrace, the feeling that you are not alone in carrying the weight of responsibility on your shoulders. It was times like this that I pulled out an old picture of Emma, not the one where she's smiling at the camera, but a random shot where she doesn't know she's being photographed. In it, she's looking off into the distance, and there's a mixture of dreaminess and slight sadness in her eyes. I looked at that photo and thought about how we've changed, how life had shattered our dreams and plans. But then I would turn to Ethan's crib, listen to his measured breathing, and realize that not all is lost, that I had a new dream, a new goal, to raise this little man, to give him all the love and care that Emma couldn't. I sang him the lullabies that my mother had once sung to me, that I had hoped to hear from Emma. At times like these, the pain of Emma's absence was felt most keenly. I felt like an imposter trying to fill the void she left behind. There were days when fatigue and despair took over. At such times, I would lock myself in the bathroom, turn on the water to muffle the sound, and let the tears flow. I cried out of helplessness, out of fear for Ethan's future, out of unbearable loneliness. But then I wiped my tears away, washed my face with cold water, and went back to my son, trying to smile as if nothing had happened. The financial difficulties did not recede. The medical bills kept mounting, and I often caught myself thinking I was about to break under their weight. I worked my ass off, taking whatever part-time jobs I could find. At night, when Ethan was asleep, I sat at the computer, trying to find additional sources of income. One day, going through old things, I came across a box of Emma's jewelry. Among them was the necklace I'd given her for our first anniversary. I remembered how long it had taken me to pick it out, how I had saved up money, denying myself everything. Now the necklace lay there, forgotten and unneeded, just like our relationship. With a heavy heart, I took the jewelry to a pawn shop. The money from the jewelry helped pay for Ethan's next round of treatment. I felt bitter about having to part with the last reminders of happy times, but I realized I had no choice. Ethan's health was more important than anything else. Ethan was growing up, and every day it became more and more obvious how much he looked like Emma. He had her eyes, her smile. Sometimes when I looked at him, I felt a sharp stab of pain, remembering that Emma would never see what a wonderful boy he was becoming. When Ethan turned a year old, we still spent a lot of time in the hospital, but there was some good news. The doctors were talking about the positive signs, that the treatments were working. I was afraid to believe it, afraid to hope, but every day the hope grew stronger. On Ethan's birthday, I organized a small party right in the hospital room. I brought balloons, baked a little cupcake, It was the first thing I had ever tried to bake myself. The nurses and other parents joined us, and for a while the room was filled with laughter and joy. Looking at a smiling Ethan, I suddenly realized that despite the challenges, despite the pain and loneliness, I am happy. Happy to be a father to this amazing little boy, happy to fight for him, happy to see every little success he has. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, I sat next to his crib, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to think about the future. Not about bills, not about the next procedure, but about what our future might be like when we beat the disease. I imagined teaching Ethan to ride his bike, taking him to school, traveling together, and in those dreams, I no longer felt Emma's absence as a gaping wound. Yes, there was sadness. There was regret for what could have been. But there was no longer that corrosive pain, that sense of betrayal that had haunted me for months. I realized that Ethan and I were a family, a small, unconventional family, but a real family, and we could handle whatever life had in store for us. The next day, as I walked into Ethan's room, I saw him standing in his crib, holding onto the railing. It was a first, and when he saw me, his face lit up with such a joyful smile that it took my breath away. "Daddy!" he said clearly and distinctly, holding out his arms to me. In that moment, I realized that all the trials we'd been through were worth it, worth the opportunity to hear my son call me Daddy for the first time. I scooped Ethan up in my arms, held him tightly against me, and whispered, "Yes, baby, Daddy's here, and he'll always be here no matter what happens." That was the day I finally let go of the past, letting go of Emma, letting go of the pain of betrayal, letting go of the dreams of the life we would never have. Instead, I completely opened my heart to the present, my son, our struggles, our love. There were many more trials ahead of us. Ethan's illness didn't magically disappear. Financial problems didn't solve themselves overnight. But I knew now that we would make it through. Because we were together. Because we had a love that was stronger than any hardship. And even though our family was incomplete in the traditional sense, it was full of everything that really matters: love, care, support. Ethan and I learned to be strong for each other, learned to find joy even on the hardest days. Every night as I put Ethan to bed, I told him a story, a tale about a brave boy and his daddy who fought together against a dragon named Sickness. And even though there was no princess in this fairy tale to come to their rescue, they still won. Because they had a power that no other dragon in the world has, the power of love. And every time I finished this tale, I believed that one day it would come true, that Ethan and I would defeat our dragon and come out of this battle stronger than ever. As I fell asleep next to my son's crib, I no longer felt alone, because I knew that no matter what happened, I had the most important thing. I have Ethan, I have love, and that's enough. Spring came early that year. Bright sunshine flooded the hospital room, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that the worst was over. Ethan was 2 years old, and the doctors were talking about a permanent remission. We still spent a lot of time at the hospital, but now those visits felt more like routine check-ins than a fight for life. Ethan was blossoming before our eyes. He learned to walk, his vocabulary grew daily, and his resounding laughter filled our small apartment. As I watched him curiously explore the world around him, my heart overflowed with love and pride. "Daddy, look!" he would shout, showing me his next discovery, whether it was a bright flower on the windowsill or a bizarre cloud in the sky. I cherished every such moment in my heart like the most precious treasure. After all we had been through, these simple joys seemed like real miracles. We began to make plans for the future. I dreamed of taking Ethan to his first day of kindergarten, of teaching him how to ride a bike, of exploring the world together. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope for a long, happy life for both of us. But fate dealt us a cruel blow. It all started with a common cold. At least that's what it seemed to me at first. Ethan became lethargic. His fever spiked. I didn't worry too much, thinking it was just a common childhood ailment. But a couple days later, he got worse. When I brought him to the hospital, the doctors immediately sounded the alarm. The tests showed a sharp deterioration. The disease we thought we had defeated had returned with renewed vigor. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," Dr. Brown said, avoiding looking me in the eye. But it looks like Ethan has relapsed. And this time the prognosis isn't good. I listened to his words, but I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It couldn't be true. Not now, when we were so close to winning. Not when I had just started to believe in our future. No, I whispered, feeling the ground go from under my feet. No, you have to do something. There has to be some way out. But all I saw in Dr. Brown's eyes was sympathy and helplessness. He put his hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "We'll do everything we can, but you need to be prepared." The following weeks turned into a nightmare. Ethan was melting before my eyes. His little body, which was just beginning to gain strength, became frail and painful again. He barely ate, slept most of the time, and when he woke up, his eyes were full of pain and fear. I never left his bedside for a minute. Day and night I sat by his side, holding his hand, telling him stories, humming lullabies. I tried to be strong for him, to smile when everything inside was bursting with pain and despair. "Daddy, I'm hurting," Ethan whispered in particularly hard moments, and each time those words were like a knife to the heart. "I know, baby," I replied, holding back tears. "But you're strong. You're the strongest boy in the world. We'll get through this, I promise." But with each passing day, those promises sounded more and more hollow. I watched the life fading in my son's eyes and felt completely helpless. One night, when Ethan finally fell asleep after another bout of pain, I walked out into the hallway and just slid down the wall to the floor. The tears I had held back for so long came in floods. I cried, unashamedly, not caring who might see me. I cried out of fear of losing the most precious thing I had, from anger at the injustice of the fate that was taking away my little boy's chance at life, powerless to change anything. At some point, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Martha, the mom of the girl in the next room. She just sat down next to me, put her arm around my shoulders, and let me cry. "Why?" I asked through my tears. "Why him? I mean, he's just a little kid. He has his whole life ahead of him. It's not fair." Martha remained silent, just holding my hand. She knew that no words could comfort at a time like this. Days went by and Ethan's condition continued to deteriorate. The doctors talked about palliative care, about making his last days as comfortable as possible. I listened to them, nodding, but inside I was screaming with despair. How could I bear the thought of my 2-year-old son's last days? One day when Ethan was feeling a little better, I decided to create a special moment for him. Ethan has always loved bright colors and moving pictures. His eyes lit up every time he saw something new and interesting. I brought a projector and big white sheets into the room. I hung them on the walls and ceiling, creating a kind of screen around Ethan's bed. Then I turned on a video with colorful animations, flying butterflies, swimming fish, hopping bunnies, all the kinds of images that would interest a 2-year-old. When Ethan opened his eyes, his face lit up with surprise and delight. Around us, colorful butterflies flew, exotic fish swam, and funny clouds in the shape of animals slowly floated across the sky. "Daddy, it's beautiful," he whispered, opening his eyes wide. "Yes, baby," I replied, feeling a lump come up to my throat. "Look how beautiful the butterflies are. And over there, see the fish?" We spent the afternoon in our makeshift magical world. I told Ethan about different animals, showed him bright colors, and together we made up stories about the adventures of butterflies and fish. He listened with delight, sometimes trying to reach the creatures flying around us with his weak arms. It was one of the happiest yet most bittersweet days of my life. Seeing the joy on Ethan's face, his genuine admiration for this simple miracle tore at my heart. I realized that this was likely one of the last vivid experiences of his short life. Each day, Ethan grew weaker and weaker. He hardly ever woke up, and when he opened his eyes, he seemed to be looking somewhere far away, beyond this world. I kept talking to him, telling him stories, singing lullabies, hoping my voice was reaching him wherever he was. One morning, as I was dozing in the chair next to his bed, Ethan suddenly opened his eyes and looked up at me. His gaze was clear and meaningful in a way it hadn't been in days. "Daddy," he whispered. I was instantly awake and leaned over him. "I'm here, baby. Daddy's here." And then his eyes closed, and he drifted back into sleep. Something in his voice, in his gaze, made me go cold. I called for a nurse, and soon the room was filled with doctors and equipment. The next hours merged into one endless nightmare for me. I stood against the wall, watching the doctors fight for my son's life. I heard curt commands, saw concerned faces, but it all seemed unreal, like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. And then there was silence, so deafening that my ears rang. Dr. Brown turned to me, and from the look on his face, I knew everything before he even opened his mouth. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," he said quietly. "We did everything we could. Ethan's gone." The world around me collapsed. I looked at my son's still body, so small on the big hospital bed, and I couldn't believe that this was the end. That never again would I hear his laughter, see his smile, feel the warmth of his embrace. I walked to the bed on stiff legs. I took Ethan's cold hand in my palms and pressed it to my lips. And then I screamed like I'd never screamed in my life. In that scream was all the pain, all the despair, all the injustice of the world. The nurses tried to pull me away, but I pushed them away. I couldn't leave Ethan alone. Not now. Not ever. I don't remember how much time passed. Maybe minutes. Maybe hours. At some point, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Dr. Brown's. "Mr. Thompson," he said softly, "you need to say goodbye. We have to get the body ready. A body." The word hit me like a slap in the face. My Ethan, my little lively, curious boy, was now just a body. I nodded, unable to utter a word. Leaned over Ethan, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "I love you, baby. I always will. Sleep well." And then I walked out of the room. I walked out of the hospital, walked down the streets, not seeing anything around me. People turned around, seeing a man with eyes red from crying, in hospital clothes. But I didn't care. I came to the park where Ethan and I like to walk on nice days. Sat down on our favorite bench and just watched the kids playing. I thought about how I would never see Ethan running around with the other kids, swinging on the swings, making sand pits in the sandbox. The sun was already setting when I finally found the strength to get up and go home. When I opened the apartment door, I froze on the threshold. There were signs of Ethan's presence everywhere. His toys in the corner, his favorite book on the table, pictures on the walls. Every item screamed of the emptiness that now filled my life. I slowly made my way to Ethan's room, sat on the edge of his crib and picked up his favorite teddy bear. Ethan never went to sleep without it. Now that teddy bear would be alone, just like me. At that moment, I felt a strange, almost hysterical urge to call Sarah, to let her know that the son she had left behind was no longer with us. Maybe yell at her, blame her for not being there all this time, or just to hear her voice, to share this unbearable pain with someone. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number I once knew by heart, the dial tone, and then a mechanical voice. "The caller is unavailable." I tried again and again, same result. Despair came over me with renewed vigor. Even now that our son was dead, I couldn't reach Sarah. She remained as distant and inaccessible as the day she left. In an act of desperation, I decided to call Sarah's mother. Our relationship had always been strained. She had never hidden her opinion that I wasn't worthy of her daughter. But that didn't matter now. I just wanted someone in Ethan's family to know his fate. I found my mother-in-law's number in the phone book and pressed the call button. It beeped again and again. "The caller is unavailable." That was the last straw. I threw the phone across the room and burst into tears, sobbed at the pain of loss, at the loneliness, at the injustice of it all. My son was dead, and the two people who should have loved him as much as I did were unavailable. They wouldn't even know he was gone. I don't know how much time I spent like that, sitting on the floor of the nursery, hugging my teddy bear and rocking back and forth. Minutes or hours merged into one endless sea of grief. When the tears finally dried up, I felt completely devastated. I slowly stood up, picked up the broken cell phone, and left the room. I couldn't stay in an apartment where every corner reminded me of Ethan. I walked outside and just went wherever the hell I was going. My feet led me to the hospital. I stood in front of the building, staring at the windows, one of which was where my little boy had been fighting for his life not so long ago. Now there was probably another child lying there, and his parents were praying for a miracle, just as I had been. Morning found me on the same park bench. I watched the city wake up, people rushing to work, taking their children to school and kindergarten. Normal life went on, and it seemed so wrong. How could the world just go on when my Ethan was gone? My phone vibrated in my pocket. By some miracle, it still worked. It was Martha from the cheerleading squad. "Jake, I heard about what happened. I'm so sorry. If you need anything, please let me know." I stared at those words and suddenly felt a surge of gratitude. Sarah and her family might be gone from my life, but I wasn't completely alone. There were people who cared about Ethan and me, who shared our journey. Slowly, I typed back, "Thank you, Martha. I need help with funeral arrangements." After sending the message, I took a deep breath. The days ahead were going to be difficult. I needed to organize the funeral, deal with the paperwork, decide what to do with Ethan's things. But right now, in this moment, I just sat back and watched the sun rise. "I love you, Ethan," I whispered into the morning air. "And I always will. I hope there's no pain where you are right now. I hope you're happy." And then I got up and slowly wandered home. Life went on, whether I wanted it to or not. And I had to learn to live in a world where my son was no longer there. It would be the hardest battle of my life, but I knew I had to fight. For Ethan's memory, for everything we'd been through together. There was a long road of healing ahead, and I didn't know if I would ever truly recover from this loss. But I knew one thing. Every day of my life, I would remember the precious moments we spent together, of his laughter, his smile, his love. And in those memories, Ethan will always live on. It's been 5 years since I lost Ethan. 5 long years filled with pain, memories, and trying to learn to live again. Every day I woke up thinking about him. Every night I fell asleep looking at his picture. Time did not heal, but it taught me to live with this wound. I continued to work as a bus driver, finding some comfort in routine and communication with passengers. Life went on as usual, although there was an emptiness inside me that nothing could fill. There was nothing about that day that suggested it would be special. I was finishing my shift and walking down the street, immersed in my thoughts. Suddenly I heard a familiar voice that took my breath away. "Jake?" I turned around and saw her, Sarah. She stood a few feet away from me, just as beautiful as she had been 5 years ago, but with some new depth in her eyes. My heart beat faster, from shock, from old pain, from the sudden rush of memories. "Sarah," I breathed out, not knowing what else to say. We stood looking at each other, unable to utter a word. All around us, people were rushing around. Cars were driving, but it was as if time had stopped for us. How are you?" she finally asked, taking an uncertain step in my direction. I grinned bitterly. "How am I? After you left Ethan and me? After everything I had to go through alone?" Sarah lowered her eyes, and I saw her shoulders slump under the weight of guilt. "Jake, I know there's no excuse for what I did, but I want to explain. I need to explain." She looked up at me, her eyes full of pain and remorse. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk away, leaving her standing there like she'd once left us. But the other part, the part that still remembered our love, wanted to hear her story. "Okay," I said dryly. "Let's walk." We walked slowly down the street, keeping our distance between us. Sarah began to speak, her voice shaking with restrained emotion. "After Ethan was born, I fell into a deep postpartum depression. I didn't realize what was happening to me. I felt like I was going crazy. I couldn't take care of Ethan. I couldn't be there for you. Every day was like a blur." She paused, trying to gather her thoughts. "When Ethan was diagnosed, that was the last straw. I couldn't bear the thought that our baby could die. I just broke down. And instead of asking for help, I ran away. I know it's unforgivable, but at that moment it seemed like the only way I could save myself." I listened to her, feeling anger and compassion struggling inside me. I knew what depression was. having gone through it myself after Ethan's death. But still, you could have told me, Sarah. We could have coped together. You left me alone with a sick child without a word. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. How's Ethan? Is he okay? Sarah asked, her eyes full of hope and fear. I felt a lump come up to my throat. 5 years had passed and the pain was still as sharp as if it had happened yesterday. Ethan's gone, Sarah, I said quietly, looking her straight in the eyes. He died 3 years ago. He was only 2 years old. Sarah went pale. She swayed, and I instinctively reached out a hand to support her. But she recoiled, pressing her hands to her mouth. No, this can't be true. Not Ethan. I mean, he was only 2 years old. She burst into tears right in the middle of the street, ignoring the passers-by who looked back at us curiously. I stood there, not knowing what to do. Part of me wanted to comfort her. The other part of me screamed that she had no right to those tears, not after abandoning us. How did this happen? Sarah asked through sobs. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. There was a relapse. The disease came back when he was about 2 years old, and this time we couldn't win. He faded away in a matter of weeks. I was with him until the very end. Sarah sank down onto the nearest bench, her body shaking with sobs. I should have been there. I'm his mother. I should have been there for him the whole time. God, what have I done? I looked at her, and suddenly all the pain, all the loneliness of the last few years came over me with a new force. Yes, you should have been there, I said, and my voice sounded harsher than I intended. You should have been there when he took his first steps, when he said his first words, when he fought the disease every day of his short life, when he cried in pain, when he opened his eyes for the last time and told me he loved me. Sarah looked up at me with a gaze so full of pain and remorse that for a moment I almost regretted my words. Almost. Jake, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me, she whispered. I shook my head. I can't, Sarah. I can't forgive you. Not for myself. For Ethan. For robbing him of his mother in the moments when he needed her most. We stood in silence, broken only by Sarah's sobs. I felt devastated, as if all emotion had left me all at once. What? Now what? Sarah asked, wiping away her tears. I shrugged my shoulders. Nothing. We'll separate and go on with our lives. You with your guilt, me with my loss. But we could try to make things right. Start over. There was a pleading tone in her voice. I looked at her for a long moment. I had once loved this woman more than life. We dreamed of a future, of a family. But now there was a chasm between us that nothing could bridge. No, Sarah, we can't start over. Too much has changed. Too much has been lost. I turned to leave but stopped and said without turning around, I hope you find peace, Sarah. I hope you can forgive yourself because I can't. With those words, I walked away, leaving Sarah sitting on the bench. I walked without looking back, feeling each step distancing me from a past that would never return. That evening, that same day, I sat at home looking at a picture of Ethan. His smiling face looked at me with the same love and trust that it had 5 years ago. I sighed, feeling tears come to my eyes. I couldn't forgive her, Ethan. Maybe one day I'll learn to, but not today. Today I just want to remember you, our love, our time together. I kissed the picture and put it back on the shelf, then walked over to the window and looked out at the city at night. Somewhere out there was Sarah carrying the burden of her guilt and loss. Somewhere out there were other parents fighting for their children's lives. Somewhere out there, life went on, no matter what. And I stood here, in the silence of my apartment, with the memory of the boy who changed my life forever. And though the pain would never completely go away, I knew I could move on. For Ethan, for myself, for the love that would forever remain in my heart.